There's really no way to tell you about where we are headed or how things came to be this way without completely breaking your heart. So take a deep breath and let this grief-soaked lullaby sing you awake to the times we are living in and the choices that need to be made. We've built the house of this modern world on the backs of those whose world has already ended. Its glaring white walls blinding us to the pain we inflict on the earth and the violence it takes to maintain our comforts. The foundation is crumbling beneath the weight of excess and greed, and we will do nearly anything to save it, except look into the mirror. Now we're nestled on the outer edges of myths and legends that our children's children will tell, about a time when the landscape was still lush and green and fertile soil kissed our feet. A time before the skies were painted in smoke and despair, before our temperaments boiled up and over, before the waters rose until the cup filled all the way up and had nowhere left to spill, and some of us were drowning long before others. Maybe we'll learn to write new stories together. Stay with the trouble long enough to let the house crumble into dust. Braid ourselves back into the fabric of life with our human and non-human kin. Learn to live and die together. Compost down into good soil for a new harvest and tend the garden of life with our love and grief. Or maybe we'll look back from whatever vantage point death gives us and finally realize that we really did have it all, but we let it slip right through our hands.
The word climate change is unhelpful for all sorts of reasons. We tend to turn away from fossil fuels when we describe climate change. Also, the word climate, I think it's a pretty big word, but it also underplays what's at stake. What's at stake is the conditions for life on planet Earth. And I do think climate misleads people because most people in the United States are dissatisfied with their climate in some way or another. And so people move to Arizona because they don't like the winters in New Hampshire, but they don't like the summers in Arizona. So climate is something people kind of feel ambivalent about. The conditions for life on planet Earth is something that I believe we can unite in saying that those are necessary and good.
Climate science is a multidisciplinary field, and it's a vital tool in helping us understand Earth's intricate climate systems and predict the future of life on Earth. By analyzing data from past weather patterns, ocean currents, and atmospheric chemistry, scientists can model potential future changes. For the northeastern United States, this science becomes especially relevant. This region has experienced noticeable shifts in temperature, precipitation patterns, and storm intensities. Predictions suggest it will see more severe heat waves, altered snowfall, and rising sea levels that flood coastal areas. But how do scientists arrive at these conclusions? And what do these predictions mean for the future?
Interesting thing about climate models is that they're highly complex numerical models that try to mathematically represent all the complexities that we see in the Earth system.
So we've published research looking at the Northeast climate, Northeast U.S., seasonal precipitation and air temperature changes by approximately mid-century. And what we found was that the regional climate models, these are climate models that are operating at a higher spatial resolution, so more grid cells per mile, if you will.
You know, take your full understanding of how the atmosphere works, how the ocean works, how they talk to each other, and then put that in a write up a code to simulate that and use computers to actually do those simulations, right? So that's what the models are doing. So you can start a climate model with very simple initial conditions, and then it just works out the weather and the climate going forward on its own, based on whatever physics, chemistry, biology you've put in the model.
So the models show that it will warm more in winter versus the other seasons and more across the northern parts of New England. And the models also project that precipitation changes will be significant, mostly in winter. So winter will get wetter. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean more snow. That will probably be more rainfall in coming decades.
The difficulty is that the current generation of models are quite skillful at capturing large-scale patterns and large-scale changes that we see in the system. They struggle a little bit when you're asking them questions about very specific locations or local scales. And that's because even though these models have gotten better over time, people have been working on these models for the last 50, 60 years now. And so they're incredibly complex models. The resolution, the spatial resolution as well as the vertical resolution in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean, that has increased over time. But it's still relatively coarse to answer questions about, say, a particular town or a particular city.
Many parts of the U.S., interestingly, will see a complete disappearance of the frozen season. So some places, for example, let's say through southern Connecticut into parts of Pennsylvania, that have a very short frozen season at present. Let's say only about a month or two that averages below freezing each year. So, January and February. Those places may no longer have any days in the winter that average below freezing. So all the days will average above 32 Fahrenheit. That's a really profound change. Big impacts for things that really are influenced by frozen conditions in the winter. So you can think about things like ticks, mosquitoes, even things like allergens. Along with this change is arising essentially because of spring is coming earlier, spring thaw is coming earlier, and on the other end, fall freeze-up is coming later.
The relationship between future land temperatures and changes in the ocean is profound. Oceans cover about 71% of the Earth's surface and act as a vast heat sink, absorbing and storing heat from the sun. With rising ocean temperatures, we are seeing runaway increases in the melting of polar ice, resulting in higher sea levels and altered coastal climates. We are also seeing changes in oceanic circulation patterns, which are affecting weather systems and precipitation patterns on land, including contributing to more intense and frequent hurricanes. Ultimately, any change in ocean temperatures has cascading effects on land, too.
Efforts, there's something called Argo floats. So these are tiny machines, essentially, which you can hold in your hand. There are about 4,000 plus floats that have been dumped in the oceans all across the world. And what they do is they bob up and down through the ocean water. They go, I think they go all the way down to about 2,000 meters. And as they go up and down, they're measuring ocean properties. They're measuring ocean temperature, salinity, and some of the important properties of ocean water. And then they release that information via satellite. You can collect all that information. One of the main findings, after we've started observing the ocean a lot better, is that we've realized that ocean is warming. It's accumulating a lot of heat. There's always, you hear that greenhouse gases are trapping heat in the atmosphere, but about, over very close to 90% of that heat actually get stored in the ocean. And so if you look at, previously we've only looked at how sea surface temperatures are changing. But with this new technology like Argo Floats, now you can monitor how temperatures are changing even a few thousand meters below sea surface. And what that tells us is that even those deeper parts of the ocean are now accumulating heat at a much faster rate.
To get a clearer idea of how these heat changes will affect coastal flooding, we visited the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, a nonprofit based in Portland, Maine, with a mission to help coastal New England adapt to rising sea levels.
That warming is going to impact storm intensity for the types of storms that impact us in the Gulf of Maine, which are extratropical cyclones. What more the concern is that even the same storms hitting on top of higher sea level are really what makes a difference in terms of the flood impact. For any water level we observe during a coastal storm, so the water level we actually experience, it's the sum of a whole bunch of different pieces. So first there's what's sea level doing, and as we know, that kind of baseline sea level is increasing. There's what was the tide doing on a given day. On top of the tide, there's storm surge, which is just onshore winds piling water up over time as the wind blows during a storm. And then on top of that, there are shorter period waves. And the sort of distinction between tides and surge is a particularly interesting one in the Northeast. Cape Cod really represents this boundary of two different kind of flood regimes in the Northeast. So north of Cape Cod in the Gulf of Maine, tides are really large. The tide range is about 3 meters or upwards of 10 feet in the southern part of the Gulf of Maine, and then gets they're the largest tides in the world. In the northeastern Gulf of Maine, in the Bay of Fundy, the tide range reaches 16 meters in some of those northern embayments. And in comparison to that big tide range, storm surge is actually quite small. So tide range, let's just take southern Maine as an example, tide range is about 3 meters. The largest storm surges we experience are just over 1 meter. And so oftentimes how severe flooding is during a given storm is more about the alignment of the storm with the tide.
You know, as we get higher tides, the water is going to be coming in more and forced in more. And additionally, so sea level rise and coastal flooding, the coastal flooding is important because it's not just coastal flooding from sea level rise, but with more severe storms, we're getting more coastal flooding. So, you know, you get an offshore storm that pushes the waves onshore. It's kind of holding the tide in, pushing the tide in higher, and then you get more coastal flooding. So more severe storms equal more coastal flooding. And then with sea level rise, a coastal flood that might have only come up to here is now going to come up to here if you have a foot of sea level rise.
If present trends continue, the world in 2000 will be more crowded, more polluted, less stable ecologically, and more vulnerable to disruption than the world we live in now. Serious stresses, including population, resources, and environment, are clearly visible ahead. Despite greater material output, the world's people will be poorer in many ways than they are today. Warned the Global 2000 report, commissioned during the Carter administration. During the summer of 2023 in the Northern Hemisphere, Carter's Global 2000 report has become ever more foretelling. This year, we've witnessed near-daily climate disasters, major floods and fires in all parts of the world, extreme heat waves the world over. As of this filming, 5,000 wildfires are burning in Canada, and tens of thousands of people have been evacuated. 200 homes were destroyed in Washington state overnight. And a hurricane, Tropical Storm Hilary, made landfall in Southern California, the first in decades. Shockingly, the entire town of Lahaina on the island of Maui has been burnt to the ground by fire. Meanwhile, a heat dome dominates the central United States, sending temperatures dangerously high. We seem to be experiencing a sudden radical shift, and some scientists are saying we've underestimated the speed of climate change.
This was to be expected. What's so striking about this summer is first the fact that it's happening all over the world simultaneously. And many of these developments were predicted by scientists. If we go back 10, 20 years, they said this is the kind of developments we could expect in 2030 and 2040 and 2050.
I start with the principle that there are real limits on the conditions for life on planet Earth, set by atmospheric chemistry. Once we get above 500 parts per million, or above 1.5 degrees centigrade, additional global surface temperature, we start to see mass numbers of people dying. One can imagine wet bulb temperatures in South Asia hitting the lethal level, which has almost happened in Pakistan, for example. You can imagine tens of millions of people dying. And that is something that no humanitarian should wish to tolerate.
Just to give you an example, I mean, there was a massive heat wave in Europe in 2003, which ended up, which was responsible for over 30,000 deaths in parts of France, and it was in 2003, yeah. And people wonder, can a heat wave kill that many people in Europe? Yeah.
We're really sort of living in this critical decision point time right now where we have a small window of opportunity left to potentially slow warming such that we can avoid some of the most catastrophic potential outcomes of sea level rise.
The radiative forcing, the additional how many watts per square meter. So will we see 2.6 watts per square meter additional forcing? Will we see 8 watts per meter squared? So this is how much additional forcing is the term is used. How much forcing that the greenhouse gases will force our surface temperatures to warm.
It's still uncertain whether we'll warm to an extent where the ice sheets in Antarctica, particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet, will become unstable and start to rapidly melt and start increasing sea level at a rate that is difficult to adapt to.
Mm-hmm. James Hansen is a prominent climate scientist, former NASA director, and early advocate of action on global climate change. In 2 recent climate reports, one in June and one in August of 2023, Hansen underscored a concerning prediction. The emergence of a new El Niño in 2023 might propel global average temperatures past the critical threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, pushing us closer to alarming tipping points.
Passing this threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's sort of a threshold where we've deemed that above which we see a lot of really unwanted, worrisome impacts. Right now here in the Northeast U.S., we're pushing past that threshold and approaching 2 degrees Celsius.
I mean, Alaska, the whole circumpolar area is way above 2C right now.
Bayo Akomolafe is a world-renowned philosopher, futurist, and teacher, advocating ways for people to rethink and challenge dominant cultural narratives by incorporating diverse cultural perspectives with a more nuanced, interconnected understanding of the world we inhabit. We asked him to tell us a story that describes our current predicament.
I grew up watching my father pour in libations. Lagos, Nigeria is becoming incredibly Christianized or Islamicized, so there's not a lot of room for traditional indigenous spiritualities. But I did see a lot of elders pouring wine to the earth and muttering something or offering a prayer. And this is actually the story of the libation. To offer libation is to remember our imbrication with soil, is to remember that we are sustained by a trick. It tells the story of a certain aggrieved god whose name is Ra. And Ra is angry because no one respects him, because he's drunk most of the time. He marches his way back to heaven in a tantrum and calls his wife Hathor, who also happens to be his daughter, who also happens to be his mother. It's a very complicated Facebook status he has, and says, I want you to avenge me. Hathor's instruction is to go down and kill everything. Men, women, children, everyone. So she does. She goes down. She takes bodies and she eats them. And then she leaves puddles of blood in her wake, which she then proceeds to lap up because she's bloodthirsty. And then she goes to bed and then resumes the impenetrably difficult task of destroying the planet the next morning, and the next morning after that, and the next, and the next, and the next. And everyone is dismayed. Everyone is crying out to Ra now and saying, which fulfills his own inner desire to be worshipped. Everyone is begging the dude now and saying, stop, please stop. And so Ra is like, yeah, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's good. So I'm good now. Hathor, you can come back. But you see, Hathor doesn't intend to stop. And so she's on a rampage. And Ra now has a problem too. Because if Hathor destroys humankind, then there's nothing to worship Ra. And so Ra is in some trouble too. Ra convenes this conference. It's like a climate conference of some kind. They cannot find a solution to the problem. They don't know what to do. A child, in a preferred telling, and I might have had one or two things to do with this iteration. A child speaks up and says, we can't stop her. She's unstoppable. So how about we trick Hathor? And they invite the child to explain further. And so the child says, hey, how about we drop red wine on the ground? When Hathor sees these puddles of wine, if she drinks it, she gets drunk, and then she hopefully forgets her objectives. And this is what they do, and it works.
And say, okay, well, what can we negotiate with then? We can actually negotiate not easily, but we can negotiate more easily with the elites who run the fossil fuel sector. We can negotiate with their captive or not so captive politicians. And we can negotiate with the people running a bulldozer and trying to dig a trench for a pipeline, right? So even that, although those negotiations are hard, they're a whole lot easier than continuing to pump methane and CO2 into the atmosphere and believing that you can negotiate with the gods who run the atmosphere. You can't negotiate with them.
There should be no doubt that humans have had the greatest impact on our warming planet. Our society dumps billions of tons of carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. To solve this problem, we go looking for scapegoats. Someone we can blame among wealthy elites and captains of industry. But these scapegoats only exist because every human on this planet needs the energy and services they provide.
There's a sense in which we think about a climate chaos and yes, climate chaos and collapse as something out there we can fix that restabilizes us humans as the potential saviors of the situation. We can rush in and save the bomb from exploding. But something about that binarized way of thinking about the world and its problem leaves us intact.
Climate change has occurred in the past over the centuries, not as severely as we're seeing today, but certainly there have been times of extreme drought, for example, prolonged extreme drought, that has tested the survival of large civilizations like the Mayan civilization. The Mayans of Mesoamerica are believed to have had populations in the tens of millions living in cities that today are covered by jungle. The people who live there have vanished, and the cities are overgrown. And what the archaeological evidence suggests is that when faced with these climate challenges that they all did, the elites tended to perpetuate their way of life. They did not alter in any substantial way the systems of production and food, agriculture that provided their privileged position. And world leaders have committed themselves in the Paris Climate Accord of 2015 and numerous speeches.
In my career, I've worked, at the UN, at the national government, in the White House. Now we're working with state, county, regional, municipal level governance. So I've had this broad spectrum of experience of working at different levels of government. And, there's the higher up you get, a lot of times the the more variability you can get over time, right? I mean, we see it in our own federal government, right? We put all this diplomatic capital into climate diplomacy to broker the Paris Agreement. Then we withdraw, and that gives China an out to sort of not be as aggressive on climate action.
In China, despite all the promises to make green transition, China continues to burn more coal than the rest of the world put together, because the elites say this is essential for our economic growth. Yet the same elites are involved in perpetuating the fossil fuel economy that's responsible for climate change.
When you actually want to retire an energy system, you have to look back to the one time that happened, which was the abolition of slavery in the Americas. Enslaved Africans were imported as a package of energy in Caribbean and southern plantations, often worked to death and replaced with more enslaved Africans coming across the Atlantic from Africa as an import of energy. And this no longer happens. And this, in fact, this practice is considered so archaic and so morally repugnant that we don't even, which is good, that we don't even consider it an energy transition, an energy system anymore. And that kind of complete replacement and moral and practical retirement of an energy system is what needs to happen regarding fossil fuels. So that's the way I think about the politics that will ensue when we start to retire fossil fuels. It will be a very conflictual situation, possibly involving war, as the abolition of slavery did in the United States. I think we should be prepared for some very antagonistic and oppositional kinds of politics and some incredibly heavily weighted moral decisions.
Modernity would invite us to think that we are absolute selves. We are individuals, we're independent, we're separate from everything else. We think here, we navigate the world, we represent it. When we represent it adequately, that becomes knowledge, right? So it's very anthropocentric, the ways we navigate the planet. We're not outside of these structures. We're habituated with these structures. These structures are movements congealed, right? And we are movements congealed as well. It's not that we we pre-exist the ways we navigate the planet. We are cartographies embodied, right? So we move and we navigate, and then this becomes a logic in itself. It becomes a clearing of some kind, and it takes on this colonial status that enlists bodies in how it becomes, right? This is what I mean by capture, sensorial capture, that the world sometimes spills something monstrous that is unexpected. I think children are constantly monstrous. They are monstrous proliferations. By monstrous, I don't mean negative or pathological. I mean something that is outside of the functionality of the familiar, right? Something that strays away from the way we think habitually. So this is really what I mean by capture then. We are captured. This capture influences how we think about food, how we talk to each other, the politics that emerges from that. So that what you need now, brother, is a break from that capture. We need a break. And to me, a politics that focuses on that break and convenes around it as a source for creativity is the politics that I'm really attracted to.
No, I mean, some of the climate movements now, I would say, are at the cutting edge, are getting into those incredibly conflictual moral questions. And those tend to be the movements that are prepared to act outside the law and outside the conventional legislative and policy practice. So we have people who have given up, you might say rationally, given up on government's ability to shut down fossil fuels, and they're trying to do it themselves. By preventing the development of new fossil fuel infrastructure. I'm thinking of the civil disobedience battles over the Keystone XL pipeline, Line 3 pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. Those three are the biggest, where there had Line 5 as well in Minnesota, where there has been direct action, often led by indigenous people. And indigenous people in the Americas, of course, are very used to, because of their history, used to thinking outside the law and outside the legislative process, which has been so damaging to them. So we really do have, it's fortunate that we do have in the last 10 years or so, a cutting edge of the climate movement that's thinking well outside the box, and I think thinking very realistically about the kinds of challenges, both from atmospheric chemistry and from social forces that we're going to have to contend with.
I had started to say something about post-activism earlier as the kinds of relationships that emerge from explosions, right? It's like, imagine we're all in a Lego brick world, and everyone knows their place, and everyone is firmly attached to their role, right? We do the same thing over and over again. Everything is awesome, right? And then something comes in and breaks and disrupts this movement. The way we use the public, the way we anticipate the future is suddenly disrupted by this intervention, this parabolic transversal crossing of some kind. It's in that moment that some things become possible to see that were hitherto impossible. Suddenly we have new questions, like, why do we need to go to work? The pandemic. Why do we need to go to school? Why do we organize work in this way, right? Why is it organized in this? Suddenly new questions become possible. So post-activism is not a dismissal of activism, a dismissal or pathologization of protest. It is noticing and naming those moments when other kinds of movements and politics become available, and maybe not just available, but urgent.
Climate change is here, now. It's no longer a question of something distant we can prevent. We are all living with it and often fighting for and losing our homes and our towns. So the question is, how do we adapt?
So we develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And we really focus our work around 4 global ocean challenges. The first and foremost is climate change, but we also focus on sustainable seafood, healthy ocean ecosystems, and a competitive 21st century regional blue economy.
Regional food economy.
Blue economy.
Blue economy.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So really thinking about, how our livelihoods, sustained by, using the marine environment. So that includes wild harvest fisheries, it includes aquaculture, it can include offshore wind, other sorts of renewable energy, other types of marine uses, even tourism and recreation in the coastal zone. So there's a lot of different kind of components to a blue economy, but anything that's linked to the ocean.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher and consultant, and I work mostly on adaptation to climate change. How do we deal and prepare for the impacts of climate change? I also am very interested in how to communicate and engage effectively with communities in this process, and how to improve the relationship between science and policy and science and practice, basically so that science is more effective in informing decisions and the practitioners get what they need from science.
And I came to the city as an environmental planner in 2000, and the city didn't have an environmental planner. So while they paid attention to environmental concerns where there was needed, there wasn't really anybody focused on it at a staff level. They had a conservation commission who did most of the work in terms of wetlands and wetlands permitting, did some conservation land acquisition, that type of thing. In the mid-aughts, yep. And then I came in and staffed that conservation commission and started working on grants to inventory what we had, looking at the wetlands and the wetland boundaries in the city, looking at our prime wetlands, looking at our vernal pools, looking at conservation land and other grant opportunities, because we didn't have, when you don't have a staff person focusing on it, you don't have someone who's going out and looking for grants. So my thought was, if we want to expand the program, the best way to do it is to bring some grant funds in from the state or federal partners. And we were able to do that, and I think got a better understanding of our resources and did some inventory work on what we had, and then looked at what we could do to protect some of that, and either purchasing property or changing regulations and things like that.
Yeah, so really what I wanted to do was to help the hundreds of coastal municipalities throughout the region that are really facing arguably existential threats as a result of climate change, and make sure that they are kind of empowered with the best available scientific information, but also kind of the range of kind of response options that are at their disposal to deal with climate change. So really, our focus has, to a large extent, been on changes in the ocean ecosystem and what that means for coastal communities that rely on them, but also thinking about sea level rise and coastal flooding, and how can communities kind of prepare for those kinds of things.
So we're talking about, where do you focus on more, mitigation or adaptation?
Historically, we've been focusing much more on impacts and adaptation. Increasingly, we will be getting into the mitigation space.
Well, for a long time, adaptation was not perceived to be necessary. It was when it started to be, considered necessary, people started to think, well, if we focus on adaptation, does it send a message that we're done with mitigation, that we've failed preventing the problem, and now we are dealing just with the mess that's resulting from it? And I've looked into that, and it turns out it's never the case, because once people understand how difficult adaptation is, they'll run back to mitigation and try to do what they can to prevent the problem. So it's not been a contradiction, and really by now the science tells us, and the practice, the reality tells us, we need both at the same time.
Can you explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, so mitigation is the attempt to reduce the emissions that go into the atmosphere and cause the warming. So you basically are trying to slow down, minimize the problem on the front end, the way I think about it. And adaptation is recognizing that even if we do everything we can, the rest of the world, has failed to prevent warming from accelerating, and so we actually are experiencing impacts, and they will be coming. Many people, many communities already face them. So what do? That's adaptation. That's dealing with the impacts on the back end of the problem.
So additionally, since I've been here, sustainability has really grown. The interest in sustainability and the interest in protecting what we have, but also protecting it for future generations. And maybe we need to do a better job at that. And so climate change obviously has been a big part of that. We, through the push from the Sustainability Committee, there's been a lot of different sustainability initiatives developed. The most recent one, I guess the biggest one, is the push for the city to do a climate action plan. And a climate action plan is a way for the city to understand the impacts from climate, but then to guide it moving forward. What does it want to do in terms of priorities? How much money does the city want to spend as a city on climate action priorities? We're in the middle of that now. We've had one big public meeting. We've done a lot of outreach with the public. We're going to have a second public meeting here in July, end of July. And it's really to gauge that interest, but also to show people where we are and what we can do to make things better.
The state of Maine has developed a framework for climate action called Maine Won't Wait. And it's really just kind of a scaffolding for every kind of municipality, nonprofit organization, academic institution, small business, wherever, to really see themselves in acting on climate change. And so we've basically leveraged that framework to support, to date, close to 30 municipalities in raising awareness about their risks from sea level rise, and also to start taking action. And a big piece of what we're trying to do is to make sure that every corner of a community is brought into the process. And so, one thing we say is that no solution is a lasting, sustainable solution unless it has broad community buy-in. And so one of the things we really try to do is kind of facilitate some of those really challenging conversations, elicit those values from people. What do you like about living here? What is it that you don't want to change? And what change are you willing to accept?
It's interesting that you say it gets political. When I first started to deal with adaptation, actually in the 1990s, and into the early 2000s, before people really got into it, they all said, oh, that's the one thing that's not political. Mitigation is completely political, but adaptation is not. Turns out it's not true. Anytime you make decisions about anything that people are interested in, it gets political. And, the resistance to it, I would say that was early on. Now, particularly at the local level, people are just faced with the consequences of climate change. They have to do something. No local politician gets elected or stays elected if they don't deal with the problems right in front of them.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that we've kind of been trying to tackle is, it's always about, what affects the community and what affects the residents in the community. And looking at climate change, we kind of looked at all the different factors of climate change, and the one that's sort of risen to the surface is sea level rise and coastal flooding. And sea level rise is something that we studied. We looked at where the sea level rise is going to happen, where it's likely to impact the community, and how we can respond to it. And so the first look at it was let's just map it, see where the water is going to go over different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at that, we really realized that the historic district and south end of the city was the most vulnerable in terms of human occupied areas. There's definitely some vulnerability along Sagamore Creek where we have low salt marsh areas, and there's not a lot of room, some room, but not a lot of room for the salt marsh to migrate inland. So, the thought of losing salt marsh habitat is really, really destructive to the ecosystem and to the fisheries, because so much happens in the salt marsh, so much larval development of fish happens in salt marsh. So you lose salt marsh, you lose fisheries offshore.
There is just not a lot of capacity to take on this ginormous problem now of how do we deal with, in a farming community, what do we tell our farmers? How do we maintain our roads that get washed out more frequently? Freeze and thaw cycles in the winter here in New England is just a huge thing, right? And the more climate goes, wacky like we had this past winter with, 70 degrees in January and minus 17 in April, it just goes back and forth, and it's hard on the infrastructure. Heavy rainfall is a big deal here in New England. So how do we prepare for all that runoff? It needs to go through the same pipes we have, and it's too small. So the pipes, the culverts, everything washes out the side of the roads, and you have to repair it. That's an added cost. That's something to plan for. Most of these people were not trained to deal with that, and they just simply don't have the time or the money to deal with it.
Yeah, and that's why I was so drawn to the nonprofit space, right? We exist to fill that niche that can't be solved by, the free market, right, in a lot of ways, right? We are trying to provide services that do not yet have kind of necessarily a market capitalization to them, right? And so part of that is the awareness raising component. Part of that is kind of walking people through what the response options are and what the trade-offs are associated with those response options, helping them, through the nuts and bolts of navigating financing to actually get shovels in the ground to put in a seawall or elevate a roadway.
But we also don't have a good democratic culture in making decisions around these things. Yes, we call ourselves a democracy, but the actual practice is, yes, checklist, we have to do engagement, 4 people show up, check, we're done, right? And then everybody complains that they weren't involved and that they, whatever. So helping people to understand the necessity of that, helping them gain just some tools in their toolkit of how to engage people more effectively and actively, make it worth their while, and be willing to actually heed the advice you then get from the community. If you want to engage someone, you can't just say, okay, thanks for that, and now we're going to do something else anyway, right? Mm-hmm. You actually, as a elected officials or a town staff, you would need to actually then take account of the input that you receive. So, and then you're not done with that either, right? Then it's about transparency and showing here's what we did in response to the input we got, and you communicate that back. So it's this iterative process of engaging, and as you know, a lot of these things are not just everybody is in agreement on where this needs to go. People have very different opinions. How to engage people who are totally resistant to, say, immigration or to doing anything about climate change, versus seeing it and reframing it in ways that actually are supporting the goals that we could agree on across political affiliations, across our values and something like that.
The way we tend to think about climate change is as if there's an on-off switch, and at some point you flip from where we are now, the geological era of the Holocene, into climate change, or the climate crisis, climate emergency, or the Anthropocene. And that really doesn't, I think if you think about it for a second, that really doesn't make sense. Things are a little more gradual than that, and climate change, or the new climates, will have their own history and their own set of stages. So I would describe us as in early climate change right now. We're at plus 1.2 degrees centigrade as a global average surface temperature. We're in this early phase where we're not in the stability, in the interglacial stability that the human species, or that, let's say, cities and agriculture evolved in. We're in something different, which is a more violent climate, an unpredictable climate in most parts of the world. And we're seeing people dying and people compelled to migrate as a result of it.
According to an article published in May 2023 in Nature, habitat destruction has already forced 9%, or 600 million people, outside the Earth's habitable zone. Without meaningful change, social disasters will increase as climate-caused damage to infrastructure and food systems multiplies. Already in the United States, people are moving to escape climate change. And as warming forces more environmental changes, we can expect to see the temperate zone in the United States gradually move north and into Canada. What will it be like when major populations begin to migrate? We only have to look at what's happening right now in New York for an answer.
And it's not going to get any better. From this moment on, it's downhill. Oh, you're not welcome.
I'm not moving from this spot, so this is close. That is it.
Not having control at the border is insanity.
That's a lot of what is facing the communities that are, not only having to deal with the impacts, but they're also now expecting more people to come into the very communities here out in the western part of New England. It's just a lovely place to be. It doesn't seem as hot and crowded as, say, Boston or in any of the other ones, New York City, and so it's just a tremendous challenge added to what already was a full plate for all these people here.
Is there a culture of openness to these people coming in, do you feel, or is it still too early stages to feel that issue?
I think it varies where you are. During the pandemic, a lot of communities experienced a sort of temporary influx, and it just, brought the housing prices up, into enormous levels, and that makes it hard for everyone who already lives here, right? So communities that have experienced that might be alert and might sort of recognize, but they may or may not be already thinking about climate change and migration that might be driven by whatever happens on the coast or in places that are too hot, too dry, too whatever, right, to live in. So I don't think I could say it's there is resistance or openness one way or another. People tend to not necessarily like, foreigners, right, to come in. And foreigners, I mean, not just from foreign countries. I mean, from
anybody.
2 hours away, right?
Right.
So it anybody not from here is not, that's like a little suspicious. But it depends. Some other communities that have been declining for a while, they might actually say, well, this is good. This is good for us. It brings our economy back alive and makes it more vibrant. It draws culture when you have more people. It's a big draw. So it's not like one way or the other. It varies from community to community, depending on whatever these communities experienced in the past. And as I say, for most of them, it's too early to think about having a huge influx driven by climate change or mainly by climate change. Most are not yet aware of that. In small communities like the one that I'm living in, where there is so little capacity to think even about the current problems and deal with what is, those people will be hit unawares. And all of a sudden, we're going to have not just a housing crisis in Boston, we're going to have a housing crisis here, right? And I mean, people are already sensing that, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And if anything major happens, like, my nightmare scenario is a big change in the West Antarctic ice shield, and a rather much faster meaning not just 8 inches over the course of the century, but maybe twice that, a much faster rise in sea level will make lots of people in coastal areas not want to live there. Now, will they all come here to Hadley, to, the Pioneer Valley, to western parts of Massachusetts? Not immediately. People like to stay close by where they have their work, where the kids have schools, whatever. But if that becomes a growing issue and, together with all the other challenges of living in expensive urban areas, we might see a much more rapid influx. And, people here will need help to start thinking about that, and not just one town at a time. Right? This is a regional problem.
So there's certainly a big push right now for affordable housing. And really the city, I think, is most focused on workforce housing. So the workforce that works in the city doesn't really have a place to live in the city, or a lot of it. And so that's pretty key. That's not a new priority. It's been a priority for years, but I think there's been a more recent push to try to get some things going. There's the Portsmouth Housing Authority, which maintains and provides housing, both subsidized and lower cost. We're trying to look at it from a zoning standpoint. How can we provide incentives for developers to build housing that includes workforce housing in it? So the incentives can include open space. If they do open space, then they get another floor. If they do workforce housing, they get another floor. Those are the sort of the incentives, the way incentives work. So what we're trying to do is pull back on sort of the open space and focus more on the workforce piece. So maybe give more incentive for workforce and less incentive for providing a little open space that the community can use, which is important, but prioritizing the workforce is even more important. I think the other challenge is looking at areas in the city that don't have haven't attracted housing development that's affordable. How do we get that to become affordable? And it's a challenge because Portsmouth is such a desirable place. You get developers that want to build things that are, high end because they can make more money on it and make more attractive projects that they want to build. How do you get developers in that want to build projects that are going to be more suitable for everyone? How do you get smaller size footprint homes, multi-family homes? The biggest thing we've done lately is try to expand the use of ADUs, so accessory dwelling units.
As an engineer, you're bound by a set of professional norms and by regulations to develop your piece of structure, whatever you're doing, a bridge, a road, a building. You have to build it according to certain specifications, and they're typically based on historical climate data. So taking an average over the last 30 years, and that's what you basically are supposed to do. And that's the standard, professional standard. Now, if you want to go above and beyond that, you actually step out of professional standard behavior, which means you're not necessarily covered by the insurance, your liability assurance, right? So there's all these obstacles to actually, even if you wanted to do it, right? You wanted to do. So, some of us need to work on removing those barriers and working with elected officials to get, change their zoning or the building code or whatever it is
to allow
for things to actually be built with the future in mind as opposed to building to the past, right? Right now, there's all this money coming from the federal government for infrastructure. Great opportunity. What if we all build that infrastructure to the data of yesterday? That's wasted money, right? As much as you need that new bridge, if the bridge isn't built for the storms that are coming next year, sorry, it's going to wash out and you just lost $30 million or whatever it is.
Yeah, land use is where, what are the requirements? So how many square feet of a lot do you need to have to build a single family home? How many square foot area lot do you need to have a multifamily, that kind of thing? Those are all spelled out in the zoning ordinance, so each zone has an allowance for what you can build. And we're trying to look at that with the eye to how do we put something in the zoning ordinance that attracts workforce housing. And it's a difficult calculation because just attracting housing doesn't always mean it's going to be workforce. So how do you get that requirement that it be workforce without putting too much, pressure on a developer who can't afford to make the numbers work?
Workforce housing may sound like a perfect solution for business owners seeking low-cost labor and workers seeking affordable housing. But ask yourself, what happens when workers get a better paying job? Do they lose their housing too? Better yet, why do we need workforce housing in the first place? Why is it the government's job to subsidize businesses who don't pay workers a livable wage? Is workforce housing really a solution? Or is it something else? perhaps a dystopian adaptation in a society on the verge of collapse.
I've written a book called All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. And I spent 3 years interviewing generals, admirals, and studying how the Department of Defense thinks about climate change. And the Pentagon leadership, now, of course, they also worry about China and Russia and so on, but they also think about climate change as an existential threat to the United States. They use that term, existential threat to the national security of the United States. And why is that? They say because not only is it going to create global chaos, Canada being an example, but more importantly, it's going to drive, it's going to cause severe chaos and humanitarian disaster, starvation around the world, creating mass migrations. And those mass migrations are going to be a permanent problem. I mean, the United States is already facing that on the southern border with refugees coming from Central America, from Haiti, from other places that are experiencing severe effects of climate change, already more severe than we face. But Europe is facing this on a much larger scale with people coming from Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, where climate change is already ravaging large parts of many countries, destroying agriculture on a large scale. So mass migrations coming into Europe, creating political chaos within Europe, threatening NATO solidarity in many ways. So from the Pentagon's perspective, you have all this chaos. Then on top of that, they see that the United States itself will experience severe climate effects like we've seen this summer, and these will multiply in the future. And so the military will be diverted from its historic task of protecting the country from foreign enemies to protecting the country from the ravages of climate change. So they see that this kind of emergency response, which increasingly involves taking over the role of government, will be their future. I mean, as a political scientist, and that's how I was trained, the essence of a functioning nation state, any political scientist would say in the first lecture of the year in Political Science 101 is what constitutes a functioning state is that it has control over its borders and what happens within those borders. So in the case of Canada, Canada has essentially abandoned a large portion of the country to fires and told people to evacuate, in some cases permanently. And it's given up its attempt to control those fires. I know that things happen day by day, but as of this moment, it's September 7th, many of those fires that began in June are still out of control, and people who had to evacuate, many of them are still living in refugee conditions, essentially. And it's unclear that Canada will ever be able to control its forests and its remote regions. And this, to my mind, is an indication of a state that, in purely political science terms, is abandon its responsibilities as a nation state. And this is an example of what we will see as climate change advances, that yes, some areas will remain functioning, but other areas will be abandoned.
I consider myself a post-nationalist. I don't often get into the weeds about how a post-nationalist world might look like, because I think imagining that would be nationalism. imagining the next, right? Because I don't know any other kind of way to be in the world except through nation states. I, among others, are yearning for something else because we sense that this Westphalian order, right, after the Treaty of Westphalia, right, this Westphalian order is designed, it cannot hold the weight and the burden of our yearning for other ways of being in the world, right? We have largely defined ourselves, you know, or named ourselves and christened ourselves under empires and flags and anthems, right? Climate chaos is probably a perfect storm that disrupts those boundaries. And we're still trying to respond within those boundaries, like we're marshalling and shepherding desire to fit our capitalist frames of imagination. But I think those borders are being, what's a stress test? Like, this is a stress test, and they're being burdened heavily, not just by floods or the weight of impending doom, right, in the popular imaginaries of climate chaos, but by people and a world that seems to long for other ways of crafting sociality that is not mediated by where are you from, right? And I don't know what that looks like, but I know that this yearning is alive, and it will probably gain, you know, an image comes to mind, you know, the Little Prince, the cartoon, the book. Okay. The Little Prince, it would take the cartoons I watched when I was a kid would take a butterfly net and catch a comet from planet B612, I think, and fly to other planets, right? I think our yearnings are catching comets of some kinds, and those comets are the troubles, the monsters, the insurgencies of invisible qualities that are now rising from the ground that we thought was already done with. Like these cracks emerging, new gods and goddesses and spirits and archives and ancestry, you know, ancestors just emerging. We have to work with these allies. We have to find new ways of experimenting with politics. And maybe from that place of experimentation, we would be able to divine new cartographies, new maps for how we arrange ourselves.
But what if it's too late? What if, as James Hansen predicts, El Niño pushes the world past the 1.5 degree threshold and into, as he puts it, a new climate frontier? If you look, you will see a growing number of doomers, like Guy McPherson, retired University of Arizona professor, whose forecasts of imminent doom have made him a controversial figure. Will we cross tipping points in 2024 that could unleash global disaster and push humanity to extinction in the next few years? Or consider Mark Mills from the conservative think tank, the Manhattan Institute, who makes a strong case that we simply will not be able to make the transition from fossil fuels simply due to limited resources. Or Dr. Tim Garrett, whose 2009 paper asserts that we will need to build a nuclear power plant every day to avoid the worst of climate change.
A lot of people in the United States have jumped from denialism directly to despair. And they went from saying, there's no climate change, all a hoax, to saying, oh my God, we're totally fucked. I hope you don't have to edit that out. We're totally fucked, and there's nothing we can do, and we might as well just, drive a Hummer and batten down the hatches and ward off strangers. And that would be true if climate change were an on-off switch, and if you flipped from comfort to apocalypse overnight. And this is why I don't like really to talk about climate change. I like to talk about the different phases, starting with the early one that we're in and hoping to avoid middle and maybe advanced or late climate change, depending on how you want to describe it.
If you are a generation old, 20 to 30 years, you know the world we wake up to each day is not the same world we knew when we were kids. Perhaps you remember the oddball winter freeze, or the one-off heavy rain and tornado. Perhaps you remember never seeing smoke from fires over Los Angeles, or a Florida that only occasionally got hit by a hurricane. No more. The world we knew is gone, destroyed. Now we face the unknown.
The amount of energy that any object, the Earth, a bench, any object with a temperature radiates long-wave radiation. So the Earth radiates long-wave radiation, and that amount of radiation emitted by an object is dependent on its temperature. So as the Earth is warming up, it's radiating more long-wave radiation away. Unfortunately, the greenhouse gases are putting more energy downward, and the amount we're losing outward, additional outward, is not the same level. So we continue to warm. Now, eventually, if the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere stabilize, eventually we will reach an equilibrium where the amount of energy coming into the Earth atmosphere system equals the amount going out. And at that point, temperatures will stabilize.
One thing we have to grapple with is that, some of these changes might happen like this very quickly, but a lot of these changes will happen over time, right? There might be instability in one region might be doing okay. There's some parts of the world which will adapt better because they have the resources to do that. Some parts or some populations might not be able to do that.
If you leave this to our elites to cope with the challenges we face, both in terms of perpetuating the factors that are creating all of this and in accommodating to the challenges that we're actually going to experience. If we rely on our existing elites, we will face the doom that you're talking about.
The dance that occurs, in the United States in particular, but across the world between kind of the policy environment and the private sector, right? Policy sends a signal, whether it's like an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for renewable energy, that sends a signal to the private sector to make those investments in renewables and drive that sort of change. And I think we're seeing, that signal be sent much more loudly, much more clearly, much more consistently, and much more broadly across the world. And so I think that gives reason for hope.
And so we're only now beginning to understand that there are big changes happening in these systems, and some of those changes are irreversible on human timescales.
Right, but more importantly is the question of how we're going to adapt to the actual dangers, and we have to do that now. We have to start building seawalls around major cities. That has to be a priority. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. We have to rebuild cities in ways that consume much less energy. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done to adapt.
Fight against the time at this point. Yeah. Things are getting, moving faster and faster. Climate is getting really weird. And, what do you tell somebody? People love to have a single number to build to, not like all this uncertainty and variability. And, that's just,
too much.
It's hard to deal with that, right? Yeah. We're not used to that. We lived in this Goldilocks time of relative stability. I mean, within some familiar range of variability, but now it's going wacky on all ends. And so that's a real challenge for everybody involved. And, we're trying to train up as many people as we can to help make that happen. But it's a run against time at this point.
I have taught my children well that the earth is not our own, so well that now we walk down the cobblestone of our city street and they mourn and wonder at the trash tumbling at their feet. at the exhaust clouding where towering pines once stood, where soft, reverent footsteps once worshipped more of the right things. They ask why we all don't do more. In their innocence, there is no power or greed. In their innocence, we all still bleed red. In their innocence, hope still dances wildly. In their innocence, I cannot breathe. We walk and talk of favorite books. I explain dystopia without explaining the parallels haunting their child's hope. The parallels of what we cling to as fictional story as our mother crumbles and weeps beneath our feet. And I can't help but worry that in my diligence to ensure that we have done our part, I have still failed to explain that in the end, it may not be enough. In the end, our doing is what has left us undone. Have I talked enough of grief? Have I explained that the weeping of our mother is not for herself, but for us? That when we are gone of our own accord, her wild places will still stretch and play and sleep. Have I talked enough of our death? Have I told them of the stone who has spent his peaceful millennia at the bottom of Lake Baikal and who will sleep there still, long after we are gone, present, solid, unharmed? How can I strengthen my heart to be both steadfast hope and the bearer of this truth? That is, that our collective future may most certainly be one of learning new ways to take care of each other on this, our final walk home.
We will go through stuff, but the we that emerges on the other side will not be the we that is easily recognized from this perspective. It'll be a shapeshift of some kind. It'll be us allying our bodies with other creatures, right? So creation comes with destruction. They work together. Maybe it's in the midst of this upheaval that we'll find ourselves again for the first time.